How is everybody? All right, last session. I'm honored to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation, the organizing committee, and we had a really good session this morning, so hopefully we can end your conference here on a really high note. I want to begin by finding the clicker first. So this is my second trip to Brazil. The first time was in 2005. How are you, man? I got friends, there's some new friends in the audience. 2005, I came here with a group from Stanford Business School. And I was a student there at the time, and the trip was called the Brazil Study Trip. And about 20 of us came here during our spring break. And we met with a range of different people, from social entrepreneurs to business leaders like Arminio Fraga, to people in Brasilia and the cabinet. It was a very fortunate opportunity to come here with my Brazilian classmates and experience Brazil in 2005, which was before Brazil began to become one of the superpowers of the world, right? I mean, it was kind of an amazing moment in Brazilian history, and we all knew that something big was about to happen. And we had the chance to spend time with a number of social entrepreneurs and NGOs and people who were with the State Department and whatnot. It was a fascinating experience. So I was very excited to receive this invitation last year to come back. And I basically spent the past few days catching up with old friends. This is Maria Strauss, who's here in the audience today. She's a friend from San Francisco who grew up in Rio, is now back in Rio, so I was in Rio for a few days. And, minor technical problem here. But there was another picture of some friends of mine in Rio from business school, Marcelo and Lou Kingston, and their two kids. They live in Leblon, and so I had a chance to spend the night in Leblon with their two kids, and it was awesome. And then on Tuesday, I went and visited the favelas. For the first time. We didn't do this on the first study trip, which was a disappointment to me, because I felt like this was such an important experience to just understand this element of life here in Brazil and really in many parts of the world. It reminded me of being in parts of the United States, parts of San Francisco that are less advantaged, or in India. So you're all here because you're interested in social good, and this is, I think, a good place to start, is with some of these kids here from the favelas who put on a musical performance for our group. We rode on motorcycles up to the top of the hill, which was awesome. And then we winded our way down until we got near the bottom of the favela, and we met this group of kids who put on a musical performance for us, and then they wanted to pose for pictures afterwards. So I don't know if you can see me, but I'm in the back, and these guys are extremely talented. And I have the opportunity now to work with Jerry Wunda, who is one of the top producers in music. He's formerly with the Fugees and is now working in New York City with one of the top production firms, running one of the top production houses. So you'll see John Legend and Bono and Madonna and Justin Bieber all go and work with Jerry, and he and I are partnering on a joint venture. And I sent him this picture, and I said, we've got to come back to visit with kids like this, because this is really, I think, what it's all about at the end of the day, is this potential that we all have, this creative potential that we all have that's too oftentimes not fulfilled. So that's, I would imagine, why you're here, to try to help use your talents and skills to make a huge impact in the world and to unleash potential in lots of people. So hopefully I can share a few things today from my experiences that will help you in that process. So that's why I'm excited to be here. That's a little bit about the trip so far. And then, of course, everybody in Rio is like, damn, you're just going to love Florianópolis. It's like the coolest place in Brazil. So yes, so far so good. So I'm expecting this audience to be awesome, all right? Let's get into it. Okay. First thing I want to talk about is Pixar. How many people here watch Pixar movies? Wow. If only Ed Catmull and John Lasseter were here. The co-founders of Pixar, two of the co-founders of Pixar, of course, Steve Jobs would probably be very proud to see that show of hands. But that's everyone in this audience. That is a hell of an impact. Now, did you know that Pixar started out as a company that made hardware? How many people knew that? Now, how many of you were in this session this morning? Okay. So, this is a picture taken in the early 1980s of Ed Catmull, pictured right here, and John Lasseter. Now, Ed Catmull had gone to school at the University of Utah. He had studied computer science. While he was a student, he was able to figure out how to draw his hand in computer technology that was new at the time. And this is in the 1970s, and he, based on this very early development of imaging technology, decided that he wanted to make a full-length movie in digital animation. Now, everybody thought he was crazy because the technology was at least 10 years off, probably more, and nobody knew how to do storytelling. I mean, there was no knowledge about how to solve these problems. But Ed, who I've had the very strong privilege of coming to know personally quite well, we share a common literary agent. I've spent a lot of time at Pixar studying. He says he just wanted to do something great with his life. And he's a very humble man. He's a very modest man. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story about Ed. If you met him, you would think he's like your grandfather. You know, the type that's just very quiet, humble. If he were here, you would not guess for a second that he was a co-founder of Pixar. You know the type? Very, very quiet person. Now, I live in San Francisco, and so does Ed. He lives, as it turns out, a few blocks away. Now, I live in a small apartment compared to Ed's palace, you know, but it's still kind of amazing that we go to the same gym. Now, it's not a fancy gym. And I didn't even know that Ed had a place in San Francisco, because he's so humble, until I ran into him at the gym one day. And here's this guy. I mean, look at him. I mean, these guys are ridiculous, right? I mean, this is California for you. I mean, they look really funny, don't they? I mean, goofy, we would call it. It's pretty typical for California. So, Ed is not a guy you picture at the gym, is he? No. But he's there, and I see him when I say, "What? That's Ed. Is that Ed?" And it's Ed Catmull. I can't believe it. I'm like, geez, Ed. So I want to go say hello to him. And I see him on the bicycles downstairs, you know, the stationary bikes. And then he disappears. He goes upstairs, and the weight room is upstairs. I think, okay, well, I'll go upstairs and say hello to him. So I go upstairs, and I'm going to go say hello to him, and he's there, and it's a Saturday, and he's just going, making all this noise to the point where it's kind of awkward. I mean, there's like 6 people in the gym. It's a quiet Saturday morning. But he's just so intense and so into the weightlifting. And so I finally was able to get his attention while he was doing this thing. He said, "Oh, Peter, how are you?" And he goes back to being Ed Catmull. But anyway, we'll come back to why that's important. Every entrepreneur who's been very successful, who I know, I've gotten the privilege to know, has enormous, enormous passion and drive for what they do. And Ed had this vision coming out of college and graduate school. He was a PhD, that he wanted to do something great with his life. And he has this inside him. It's just there. It's his voice, right? So he goes and he works for George Lucas at Lucasfilms. And Lucas, at the time, in the 1980s, is known in the United States for making Star Wars. This is his first, kind of breakthrough series in Empire Strikes Back. He's got a lot of technologists that he's gathered together to improve digital animation and to improve graphics, right? So he hires Ed Catmull to run this graphics division of Lucasfilms, and they make this hardware that sells for about $120,000 US dollars a year per box. And so They go out and they start selling this in Japan and South Korea and some of the early technological adopter countries, right? Well, what happens is George Lucas has to go through a divorce. And in California, for those of you who haven't spent time in California, if you get married in California and divorced, it's called community property. Half of everything goes to the other person. Half of all the wealth or all the property that you have that you've acquired since being with that person married goes to the other person. So what happened was George Lucas had to sell this hardware company. It wasn't profitable. It was a startup. It was technology. Ed Catmull was known as a great technologist. So he had to sell the company. Now, who bought the company? I hear somebody saying it. Steve Jobs. Who was the person who had the voice behind it? That was great. I want to encourage that. That was you? You did. Okay, great. You're competing with her. So, I think it was you that I heard, though. But I will, you'll get your chance. So let's just look at what happens here. And this is we'll just go back for 1 second to touch on one key point. When George Lucas sold this hardware division with a great technologist, Ed Catmull, he also bought a guy named John Lasseter. Now, John Lasseter had been an animator at Disney in the 1980s. And what happened was this. When Walt Disney died, Disney went through a real spiritual crisis because Walt Disney was the creative genius at Disney, and he was the driving force for everything they'd done, and then he died. And then they'd say, well, what would Walt do? Right? Was a question everybody at Disney was asking. And so this guy, John Lasseter, had gone to art school. He was an animator, drawing animator. He loved working at Disney because it gave him the chance to do cartoons, and that was his passion from a young age. His mother had encouraged him to pursue his passion. And he gets fired at Disney. Why? Because he's trying to challenge the status quo too much. He's trying too many experiments. He pisses too many people off. You know what that means? Like, he really agitates people, even though he's the nicest guy in the world. He's just really excited about doing this digital animation. And everybody at Disney's like, what? Just relax, John. Just be an animator. Just cool it, So it's a very rigid creative culture at Disney. This is ironic that he got fired from Disney because what happened 15 years later? Sale to Disney, right? For how much? $7 billion. So Disney really wanted to buy John Lasseter. They wanted for years to get him back once he was successful at Pixar, but they ended up having to pay $7 billion for a bum, firing. So that, and they bought a lot of great technology. But these two guys were both passionate about making a digital film, even though George Lucas is saying, just make the hardware. Their passion, their belief was that they wanted to make a film. And so what'd they do? George Lucas tells Steve Jobs, just, so you know, this hardware is cool, but these guys are hell-bent on making a film. And they're doing this by literally making short films on the side. So every year, they make these short films. So John Lasseter's desk is literally in the hallway at Pixar's headquarters at Port Richmond. Literally, just in the hallway. He's like an add-on to this otherwise hardware company. He's making these short films. They start out with 1 minute long. They go to one that's 2 minutes. And what they do is they show these films at the annual SIGGRAPH event, which is an audience about this size, maybe a little bit bigger. They show these short films. The second one they showed, right after Steve Jobs bought the company, had two lamps talking to each other with squeaks, okay? An adult lamp and a baby lamp, and people at SIGGRAPH thought that they were human lamps. I don't know why. I wasn't there for it. But it seems crazy, right? But the point is they were blown away by these short films, and it was the short films that were being used to demonstrate the value of the hardware. So this was just a very small piece of what Pixar's business was. And Steve Jobs bought this company thinking that this was going to be the next big hardware company. You know, he had been fired from Apple. He'd been fired from Apple by his hand-picked successor. He had started up a company called Next, which would eventually be repurchased by Apple. He buys this hardware company thinking that this is going to be the next big hardware company. He never thought when he bought Pixar, Steve Jobs never thought when he bought Pixar that it was going to be the next great digitally animated film company. He never thought they would make revenue on that. Amazing, right? This is Steve Jobs. This is a guy, you read in that Forbes magazine, the story of Steve Jobs' legacy. It's like he did Pixar, he did Apple, no. Wait a second. This is the story of what happened at Pixar. And it's not that Steve Jobs had this vision from the start of what it was going to become. Ed Catmull and John Lasseter were determined to get to a very big vision through a lot of small steps. Okay? So they keep making these films year after year, showing it at SIGGRAPH, and the audience is responding. Their brand is being enhanced. They're learning how to do the software. They're learning how to do the animation. They're learning how to do the storytelling. They have to learn everything. They're making the software. John Lasseter's reading books about storytelling to figure out how to do storytelling. He does bring in from Disney a certain couple principles that I'll share with you later. Don't worry. I'm fine. What happens? Steve Jobs invests $50 million in Pixar. He tries to sell it to Larry Ellison. He tries to sell it to Bill Gates. He tries to sell it to Ross Perot, to GM, just to get his money back. Okay? Steve Jobs. But he's smart enough that every time these guys come, Ed Catmull and John Lasseter come, to ask him if they can make just another short film, he's smart enough to say, okay, all right, we'll do this. Okay? Why is he making that decision? Well, God only knows. But I can tell you this. In 1988, Lasseter pitches Jobs with this idea for a short film about toys. And he's so passionate about it. He goes into this conference room, and people are thinking, this is not going to happen. Steve Jobs has had to lay off the bulk of the company. They can't sell the hardware. They're trying to sell software. And so people get fired. And John Lasseter's still employed, even though he's making something that's not making any revenues for the company, these short films. Pitches Steve Jobs. Jobs gives it the approval. Somehow, some way, film wins an Academy Award. Short Film of the Year, Academy Award. Whoa! Digital animation has arrived. And not only that, it's with this toy. It's called Tin Toy. It's a story about toys and kids. And so Steve Jobs was able to take that win and go to Disney and say, look at this. This is the coolest thing in film. We know how to do the storytelling. We know how to do the technology. This is the next big thing. You got to get on board with this now. We should partner to make a couple movies. And Mike, the Disney folks say, can you make a 90-minute film? Yeah, you've made 8-minute films. Steve Jobs says, sure, no problem. Disney agrees to do a 3-film deal. They provide all the assets and resources that Pixar doesn't have on their own, right? Money, staff. This is entrepreneurship. This is how it works. This is how great companies get made. This type of process, discovery process. And of course, the rest is now history. I mean, Toy Story is a huge, big success. And it goes on. But one sidebar to this story, when Steve Jobs went back to Ed Catmull with the deal from Disney, Ed Catmull said, whoa, 90-minute film, we're not ready to do that. We could probably do a 30-minute film. And Steve Jobs said to him, Ed, you can do a 30-minute film. Why can't you do a 90-minute film? And Ed was like thinking about that, and very thoughtful guy, and he ultimately couldn't answer Jobs' question as to why not. So they made an 80, 90-minute film, and Toy Story is this breakout. So the point is this. I wrote a book called Little Bets. Came out last year. The thesis of the book is that we think that big ideas come from these visionary people like Steve Jobs, and that none of us can do that. None of you can do something that's quite that unique. But the point is that not even Steve Jobs could have predicted when he bought Pixar what was going to happen. He had great instincts. He knew the technology was great. He knew the people were great. He kept betting on the people using small bets. right? Small, affordable bets that allowed him to keep learning about this new area. And only Steve Jobs can decide what's a small bet, just as only you can decide what's a small bet. But this is the reality of how entrepreneurship has worked in my experience. I used to be in venture capital. I worked as an investor in the United States and in Europe, and I had the chance to meet and interact with and learn from thousands of entrepreneurs. This is how their companies developed, not based on some brilliant vision. I'll give you one more quick example. Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks. How many of you go to a Starbucks on a regular basis? No? So Starbucks hasn't really arrived in Brazil, huh? Not in Florianopolis. Okay, that's cool, I guess, right? So, but you know of Starbucks, right? Do you know the story? Do you know, you do. So Howard Schultz, the founder of what became Starbucks, goes to Italy, has this great coffee experience in Milan. He says, I want to bring that back to the United States and just have this whole new experience in the U.S. The first store that he opened with his team had menus written in Italian, nonstop opera music playing. The baristas were wearing bow ties, which they hated. They really didn't like this at all. And there were no chairs. So, I mean, you know enough about Starbucks. It's completely different than what they ended up doing. Just like Pixar is completely different than the starting point. How did they learn what Starbucks should become? By making these small, affordable mistakes. As Howard Schultz says, and I had the opportunity to interview Howard in 2005 for True North, the first book I co-authored with Bill George, who's a Harvard Business School professor now. Howard says, we had to make mistakes in order to learn what to do. That's Howard Schultz, one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation. And by many accounts, a visionary. I mean, he really is a visionary. He's got brilliant instincts about where the market's going, just like Steve Jobs. This is the reality. Okay, so all of that said, I just want to dispel the notion that these ingenious ideas come out of thin air so that you feel, as a starting point, empowered to go out and start inventing and creating in your own context. So this is little bets. When you're doing something new, when you don't know what you don't know, like you don't know what type of Starbucks is going to succeed in the United States, make experiments to learn about what the problems are, what about the opportunities are. Once you've figured out what works on the small scale, like the Pixar tin toy, then go big. But don't waste your time trying to go big when you don't know what the problems are. You got to find the problems first. And this is what I learned from design thinking. You know, the Stanford Design School is a school at Stanford that I have had the opportunity to come to know over the past 6 years very well and collaborate with the faculty. I went through my entire 20s, up through I was about 30 years old, I did school in the traditional way. I got good grades. I tried to get, all the answers right. I did what I was supposed to do, right? Do you have a similar experience? Don't make mistakes. Was that how school is here in Florianopolis? Is that it, basically? That's crazy, right? I mean, we're kids. How do we learn what's hot and what's not? Literally, that's hot. We have to discover through this process of trial and error. As we get older, we can be much more strategic about that process. We can be much more methodical about that process of trial and error. But the problem is, most of us are so afraid to fail, so afraid of being imperfect, that we don't even try. So my argument is, use a little bet. Whatever's affordable and achievable for you is the starting point to be more creative and to be more innovative. So does that make sense as a starting point? Now we're going to have a little bit more fun as we talk about some different types of creative examples. Okay, here's Mozart, right? Just to show you, there are people who are geniuses. There are prodigies. David Galinson's a professor at the University of Chicago, and he has studied how different creative people work. He looks inside their processes. He looks at how artists work, how writers like Mark Twain work. He looks at how Matisse works. What's their creative process? Now, how many people here have seen Michelangelo's David or the Sistine Chapel? Or seen pictures? Michelangelo, right? Renaissance maybe. He was known to crumple up and destroy his sketches. Why is this? Because, in my opinion, what happened was during the Renaissance and kind of Enlightenment era was that the creative process went from one that was believed to come from the gods, where it took a lot of pressure off dudes and gals. It's like, hey man, it's like coming from the gods. I don't know what's going on here. It became much more of a, no, they're people who are geniuses. And so that put a lot of pressure on everyone to be either creative or not. David Galenson says there are people like Mozart that are prodigies who can do these types of creative process in their head, and he could, according to historians, transcribe music without virtually any changes, start to finish. Can you imagine that? Dude is amazing, right? Okay. So, fortunately, there's probably one person in the back who's a genius. Fortunately, if you're like mere mortals like me or the rest of us, there's Beethoven. And here's how Beethoven worked. His work was riddled with mistakes and changes, and he was constantly experimenting using these, what I call little bets. And he would work late into the night, draft over draft, iterating, trying to improve his ideas. And they sucked a lot of the time. Look at this, terrible, right? I mean, so does that give you some comfort? Galenson's point is this, is that what's far more interesting about innovation is what he calls experimental innovators, the way most of us have to work to invent or create. And that process requires that we be willing to make mistakes and try things in order to learn what to do, right? Do things in order to learn what to do. Create the data if you don't have the data. And as I say to people, audiences, entrepreneurs think of learning the way most of us think of failure. So failure is this really important boogeyman that we have to keep coming back to. Let me show you an example of this that I think you're going to remember for a while. How many people here have seen Jerry Seinfeld? Watched Jerry Seinfeld, right? Well-known comedian. So this guy made a ton of money with his TV show, and what happens is this. In about 2000, he decides that he's ready for new challenges. So he turns down getting $100 million a year to do Seinfeld in order to take a break. He just got married. He married this young, attractive woman, kid. He just wants to change. Okay. Made enough money. Now, Jerry Seinfeld started out doesn't overanalyze his ideas. He scribbles them on sheets of paper, yellow sheets of paper, and then he goes into small clubs like this one. So check this out. This is a small club in New York, 2001, right as Jerry Seinfeld is trying to develop this new comedy act, okay? There's about, say, 30, 40 people in the audience, and this is right at the beginning of Seinfeld's creative process. He's talking with his fellow comedian, Colin Quinn. So, here we go.
How about a big hand for Jerry Seinfeld, everybody?
That's what people always say to me, it must be so easy. It's not easy.
What's easy?
For me now, because
Right.
people know who I am.
No, you get a little bit of a break up front.
Yeah.
And then you still got to be funny. That's the beauty of stand-up, though. That's why it's closest to justice. Not that it's just ultimately, but it's close to justice. Because even Jack Nicholson, wherever he looks,
Right.
he's in the middle of a comedy show where we give him 5 minutes of grace.
Right.
And then he'd be like, okay, Jack, if you're not making us laugh, get going. You know what I mean? And he's the most beloved person there is.
Right.
So in the end, whatever it is, whether it's 3 dates or 7 dates, you're still irritated. Still annoyed, still frustrated, still hating the whole experience all the way through. And now my point here is my point. I got off on that whole thing about the number. Oh, damn it. I don't know. And I didn't even want to say what I just said. That's the ugly part. Anyway, there's something good there.
Is this your first gig?
Yeah, yes it is. Well, doing all this stuff I had never said before to anyone. It's just thoughts. So this is how comedians develop material.
Right.
And as you can see, it's quite painful.
Whoa. That was Jerry Seinfeld. Have you ever seen Jerry Seinfeld suck? That was awful, wasn't it? I even cringed watching that. I've watched that thing 100 times. We're just standing over there, we're like, whoa, that's awkward, right? That surprised you guys? It does, right? Now, when Chris Rock, who lives in New Jersey, gets up to give his new performances, he tells people, turn off your cameras. Put your cell phone away. You'd be like, put your cell phone away. All right? Now, this is Chris Rock. So I wrote about Chris Rock in the first chapter of Little Bets, and I never had the chance to speak with him. He's the only person in the book I didn't have a chance to speak with. I wrote the chapter, or the story, based on evidence from people who watched him and had written about it and got a lot of information that way. But it's kind of funny because Chris Rock, I just see him interviewed now, and he says, yeah, everybody knows how we work now. But the point is that comedians have to be imperfect to develop ideas. They have to be willing to fail. Is that failure, though? Is that failure in front of 30 people? It certainly was awkward to watch. How many people think that's failure? And it's kind of a setup question because, I'm looking for something. But I think most people would feel like they're failing if they do that. I would feel like I'm failing if I did that even in front of a small audience. I would feel not good. Just like he didn't feel good. Now that's from the documentary, The Comedian. And if you're interested in entrepreneurship, creativity, or innovation, you gotta watch this documentary because it shows how hard it is, even for Jerry Seinfeld, to develop new material. You have to be willing to put yourself out there. How many of you put yourself out there over the past few days to do something uncomfortable like that? How many? 2 people, 3 people. Whoa. Got to improve that. I thought you guys were innovators. Huh? This is the reality of what it takes. So we're trying to dispel some of the myths here. Even for Jerry Seinfeld, what's one of Jerry Seinfeld's greatest fears? What's every comedian's greatest fear? To not be loved. To have that happen. So the movie shows how hard it is even for Jerry Seinfeld, and Howard Schultz says the same thing. His greatest fear is failure. Imagine that. Howard Schultz has built a 200,000 person plus company in Starbucks from scratch, from this initial vision this changed a lot over time, and his biggest fear is failure. And I had the chance to interview him just like this, him right there for an hour and a half, and this is the point of the interview that I'll never forget, was he was sitting there clasping his hands, looking down at the ground, saying, "Peter, I think about failure every day." I said, "Howard, I'm literally like standing up in the chair, like, don't you ever just go for a walk and say, God, I've really done it in my life, you know?" "Nope, never do that. I can't do it. I wish I could." And he says he's just afraid to look in a crystal ball to see the future. Now, Frank Gehry, the architect, who we'll talk about in a minute, says the same thing. Whenever he begins a new project, even though he's done the Guggenheim, even though he's done Disney Hall, these world-renowned buildings, he still procrastinates. He makes phone calls he doesn't need to make. He runs errands he doesn't need to make. He calls it his healthy insecurity. And I've talked with him quite a bit about this. Why? You're the man. You're Frank Gehry. Like, isn't that weird? They made it to the top of their profession, and it drives them. All that's to say, back to each of you, they're putting themselves out there. Are you? Food for thought. What is failure? Is failure not being perfect? Or is failure if you go through a divorce or you're engaged and it doesn't work out? I was engaged. It didn't work out. It was very painful. 6 months of counseling. We tried. We both loyal people. We both tried. Didn't work out. We're still good friends, fortunately, to this day. That was a failure. I learned a lot from that. If you have a company and it goes bankrupt, that's failure. It's very hard here. It's very hard here to have that happen, especially hard here. Harder than in the United States. So I admire those of you who are courageous enough to try. And my point is, you don't have to try big. You can try small. Just do small things. Take affordable risks. Jerry Seinfeld, the worst thing that's going to happen is 2 people are going to go home and say, we still have Seinfeld. He was terrible. He was so bad. But you know what? After doing that for 6 months, Seinfeld will be so good that he can go into a house like this anywhere in the world and rock it. Because he's tested everything rigorously. He's learned what's going to work, what's not. He's basically improvised with the audience to develop his act. And then he bets big, and he's the man. This is what separates the men from the boys, so to speak. The gals, the lady, whatever, from the women, the girls from the... Anyway, you get the point. It's putting yourself out there. Okay, that's a fundamental belief that I have. And if you look at the statistics, it's hard to get statistics on how much failure people go through in order to create or invent. How many people here know of The Onion? This is a very popular publication in a lot of parts of the world. No? Okay, so this is a humor publication, and they have to go through 600 possible headlines each week to come up with just 18 that are going to work. So it's a 3% success rate. Now, comedians have to do roughly the same amount of experimentation to come up with ideas that work. Roughly, because I'm asking them and they're telling me about their failure rates. Failure rates, not success rates, let's call it. So the point is, you have to be willing to put yourself out there a lot and be imperfect a lot in order to really invent or create. Now, the thing that's really cool about the movie that I just described, The Comedian, is that it gets easier for Seinfeld as the process goes on. You were seeing the hardest part for him, right? So how many of you have started something new, a new venture? How many of you have done that? So, wow, that's awesome. Okay. So like 40%. Now, how many of you aspire to do that? How many of you want to be an entrepreneur someday before you die? Or want to write a book? or want to create something? 70%? 80%, let's say. That's cool. That's why you're here, right? Okay. Seinfeld experiences a creative process the same way that Howard Schultz did, the same way Frank Gehry does. Frank Gehry says when he just begins, when he just starts making things, the process becomes a lot easier. When he starts making prototypes, when he starts taking little bets. I had this experience in writing a book. It got easier as the process went on because you build confidence, and this gets into research on deliberate practice. But I just wanted to show you this statistic for the magnitude of imperfection that's needed to really do cool stuff. At Pixar, their creative process is 5 years long, and Ed Catmull describes it as going from suck to non-suck. So we'll go back to suck for a second, okay? 5-year process. They start by sketching their ideas on storyboards. They show it to their colleagues. Can you guys do this? Can you sketch ideas that you show to your trusted friends and colleagues? Can you do this? That's acceptable, right? That's an affordable little bet, right? That's how I started writing this book. I showed it to my family and friends. I said, what do you think? Is this good? Is it honest? Yeah, sort of like, what the hell are you doing? I'm like, I don't know, but it's like interesting, right? So you start at something that just is going to be imperfect. And there's a great book called Bird by Bird by the novelist Anne Lamott. To all of you who want to write a book or who have written books, it describes the creative process. And her point is that when you're at this part of the process, where we just saw Seinfeld, you have to do what she calls, her term, not mine, shitty first drafts. Now, that's a colloquialism in the U.S. meaning bad, right? Really bad, crappy. Suck is another term that's a U.S. colloquialism. So Ed Catmull's point is that when they start a film at Pixar and they show their colleagues the ideas, they're going to be bad. They are wired as a company to be prepared for that sucky phase of the process. They show, once they have enough of the characters and the story developed, they put it together, these storyboards together in what are called reels. Reels are just like the comic book version of the movie, of the story as it's set. They put it in front of an audience smaller than this one. They have screening rooms at Pixar that are about half this size. They show them the storyboards, and they do voiceovers. The staff will do the voicing for the characters. So they're like, oh, they said, and then, they'll go some. And then what they do after they show these really rough drafts to their colleagues is everybody emails their comments to a director. The director takes all these comments, iterates constantly, quickly, cheaply to improve the ideas. This is the lean startup. This is the agile software. This is the same basic process. Try a lot, inexpensive, cheap, learn cheap, bet big once you figure it out. This is simple, right? We never learn how to think this way. Design thinking, Stanford Design School, where people go to learn how to think and work this way. It's what the book Little Bets is about. Bridging entrepreneurship with design. It's common sense. It's acting like an anthropologist to get ideas. It's doing lots of experimentation. It's iterating quickly. It's learning. That's all it is. That's all Pixar is, a learning organization. Suck to non-suck. So, Frank Gehry, how does he begin a new project? This is what we just talked about. Well, this is a completed project. This is Disney Hall in Los Angeles. How many people have been here? Few people? Awesome. It's a totally cool building, even though some people have issues with it because it puts off a lot of heat. And it's definitely hot if you stand next to it. But it's an idea that, as Gehry describes it, came together from the inside out. What does he mean by that? This building is not the way Frank Gehry originally envisioned it. This is the original idea that Frank Gehry had for Disney Hall, and this is him pictured with the Disney family and with the planning committee when he won the commission to make this building. You see how different the design is? I love how proud he is in this picture. So how did he get from this to the freaking shiny building that's like a sailing ship? Well, what did he know? He knew what the Disney family wanted. They wanted people to go to this performance hall and have a magical experience, a spiritual experience, where they felt really connected to the orchestra. You know, those events you go to where it's like, wow, you don't even feel like you're in your seat, it's magical. Okay, that was the central mission. That was the aspiration. Then Geary and his team broke that mission down into many, many, many small pieces. They smallified, to use a term that some of you may know from Agile software. They took a big problem and made many small pieces. So they thought about, should we put the stage here, up front, or should we put the stage a little bit inside to make it like a theater in the round where you had audience all around? Well, they did the audience all around. How should the seats be structured? How should the panes on the ceiling be made to optimize the sound reflection? Because Geary's goal was to make sure that the orchestra could hear each other playing so clearly. They could hear the person on the other side of the orchestra playing so clearly that they were really connected as an orchestra. And therefore, the sound that was going out to the audience was going to be the best possible sound. It was going to be the absolute best acoustics in the world, based on all these small problems that they solved in each part of the chair. There was lots of little things, so that when the audience heard from the orchestra, they fed back this feeling of magical, spiritual experience. You're going to call it, and this is kind of a little bit artistic, but just, you get the point. The then orchestra plays better, and everybody has a magical experience. So the building was designed from the inside out. He didn't know at the start what it was going to be. This is how it works. This is from a documentary called Sketches with Frank Geary, and it shows you, well, briefly first, this is a problem that prevents different organizations and teams from working in this more creative way that I'm going to show you in this video. It's called the hippo phenomenon. The hippo phenomenon, this comes from Google. At Google, they call people hippos, H-I-P, or companies hippos, if the highest paid person is always the person making creative decisions. Now, for how many of you is that the case? Does your boss or the CEO or the ED or the whoever's running the show make the creative decisions? How many people have that in their organization? Be honest. Come on. Are they sitting right next to you? Now I'm starting to get a pulse for this place. All right. So, Frank Geary wants to avoid the hippo phenomenon just as Ed Catmull wants to avoid the hippo phenomenon. How does Ed Catmull at Pixar avoid it? He tells everyone, I don't know the answers to most problems. You do digital animation, you do lighting, you do this. You're the best in the world at that. I'm going to learn from you. I'm going to listen to you. Here's how Frank Geary does it.
Let's accrue value here. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
We're going to open this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
You know what's confusing to me is what you see from here.
Perhaps what you do here is there's still kind of a grade situation.
It's like a bridge.
A little.
Well, if you do that, you could almost do that and walk under it to the lakefront. That would be the ideal.
Yeah, I know.
But I mean, if we do this, it takes it out of the realm that I was worried about.
Well, I wasn't worried about that. I don't.
No, you don't worry about the same things I worry about.
I'm more naive.
Edwin is more contentious with me than Craig is. Have you noticed? Yes. For me, that's great because it just makes it all much more interesting. He's been with me 15 years. For the first 5 years he was here, he didn't talk. I couldn't get a word out of him. He just sat and watched. And then now, 15 years later, I can't stop him from talking. I don't think I could do the buildings alone anymore. I've gotten so used to the team to play with.
He surrounds himself with good people. What he likes to do is he gets the vague idea, kind of very loosely. Well, something kind of like, something kind of like this, and but kind of like, you know, what I'm thinking is something more kind of like that, you know what I mean? So this kind of thing is what I got in mind, you know what I mean? And the guys are standing around, yeah, I think I got it, Frank. And they run off and they do some stuff and they come back and he goes, no, not quite like that. I thought it's a little bit more like this, you know what I'm, like, gosh, you guys have just, you know, I want you to really kind of, more like that, you know what I mean?
No, but if you see the stair like you see here where it ends.
Where it's sticking out.
Yeah, do that.
The communication is almost nonverbal. We've worked enough together that, you know, he can say like 2 words and I'll understand what he wants. Or a quick sketch or reference to a painting or a piece of sculpture and say, try this.
The only thing I'm worried about is these guys wanted something a lot more exuberant.
They do.
Well, I'd rather go to that middle color titanium. That would be beautiful. See that red titanium?
But you sure it's not going to be too red?
The other day, we're doing our offices. He sent me a fax where I was, and he said, would you mind if we flipped the plan? So that's typical Edwin. You know, I would do that myself if he wasn't there, but he's there. I think of it as an opportunistic thing. Maybe one of the kids in the office, just the way he put the model together that day, made me see something. They see they're part of it. So it engenders a great sense of teamwork, which gets you to the end. Craig and I will go home tonight, separately, and we'll agonize about this. And we'll come in tomorrow.
We'll have a dream tomorrow.
And we'll say, and we usually come to the same conclusion when it's wrong, right? And what makes it wrong? What's wrong is if it's too easy, or if we think we're falling into some kind of cliche.
Or we already did it.
Or we already did it.
That's different. That's different than too easy, right?
Too easy is that
too easy?
I guess I got to suffer a little before.
But that's neurotic. How do you tell the difference between an aesthetic discipline and neurosis?
So, as you can see from that clip, Frank Gehry aspires to surround himself with people he can improvise with. And you can learn these skills. At Pixar, they call it plussing ideas, where instead of judging every idea as it comes through, you bounce an idea off your colleague, and they take that idea and they say, yes, I like that, Frank, but what if we did this? You don't use the word but, sorry. See, it's an easy trap to fall into. We're so used to analyzing and criticizing and getting the right answer that we go into an environment where we're trying to do something creative and we end up judging ourselves and everyone else. And the key to discovery, developing that part of your brain, is to not judge too quickly. So as Frank Gehry does, he takes the idea from his colleague. He says, and what if we did this? You notice that? That's called plussing at Pixar. That's exactly what Pixar does. That's the magic of Pixar in my estimation. Yes, and what if? This is how ideas get developed. And the neuroscience research is increasingly compelling on this front, as is the psychology research. Create safe environments to develop ideas without judgment, and the part of you that's creative begins to open up through little bets. So, equally important is Frank Gehry is not the hippo. He's the guy who's he literally is just a collegial guy. When you talk with him, he feels like you're just talking with your grandpa or something. And he says he's easily unoffended. Not easily offended, he's easily unoffended. I think that's partially true. I think he is easily offended too, but if there's external criticism, he gets offended, I've noticed. Not from me, but other people, like the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. now. But when he's with his team, he's easily unoffended. They push each other, they play, they improvise to develop their ideas. They go from Model 1 to Model 2. The ideas keep developing. They do a lot of analysis on the models to make sure they're keeping within their budgets and their timeline and their monetary constraints, and they invent that way. Collaboration. Okay. So you're probably all natural collaborators. What I'm passionate about right now is what I think Frank Gehry and Ed Catmull and Jerry Seinfeld and Anne Lamott are all doing, and that many of you are doing on your own. You're challenging the status quo in your own ways. You're creative in your own ways. You've got an artistic side. You've got a creative side. You've got an entrepreneurial side that's yearning to express itself. And that's really hard. It's really hard for Frank Gehry. It's really hard for Howard Schultz. It's really hard for Jerry Seinfeld. So I'm the founder of a company that is a socially beneficial corporation that is in the process of being incorporated called Black Sheep. Now, Black Sheep is a term I stole from Pixar. They know it, too. Brad Bird, a director of Pixar who made the movie The Incredibles. Know that movie? Came to Pixar after Pixar had made 3 very successful blockbuster movies, maybe 4. He interviewed with Steve Jobs, John Lasseter, and Ed Catmull. That sounds like a stressful interview to me. I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying. The interview went like this. Catmull and Jobs and Lasseter all had the same message for Brad Bird. You've been successful as a director. You're passionate about digital animation. You haven't made digital animation. We want you to come into Pixar as a director from the outside, and we want you to challenge us. We want you to challenge us because our biggest fear is of complacency. There's a great interview with Brad Bird in the McKinsey Quarterly, conducted by Stanford professors Bob Sutton and Huggy Rao, in which Brad Bird describes this process he went through to interview with Pixar. So they said, come in, challenge us. Brad Bird thinks, it's amazing. Goes to Pixar with ideas for the movie The Incredibles, is told that his ideas are too complicated. They're going to be too costly, too technically impossible to do. And Brad Bird says, forget that. Give me the black sheep. I want the artists who are frustrated, ones who have another way of doing things. You know the type? Maybe you, probably you, a lot of you, a lot of nods. Okay? Give us the black sheep. This is at Pixar. Pixar. Most creative company I know. Black sheep at Pixar must be pretty badass. Okay? So I admire that. And so, you know, a group of us goofballs in California last year were frustrated with the state of the publishing industry. You know, we're writing these books and doing all this work and 2 years of research, and then you go out and promote it, doing everything on your own. Publishers putting the books in bookstores, maybe not. That's the reality. So we're pissed. We're in California. We're like, let's do something about this. So we start making these hats at Cafe Press, black sheep hats, in honor of Pixar. And we start riffing and joking. We go to Pixar for improv performances. Every month they have improv performances at Pixar that you can get invited to, actually. And we start going to this place, the Can't Fail Cafe. The Can't Fail Cafe, right across the street from Pixar in Emeryville, California. How cool is that? The Can't Fail Cafe. It's owned by one of the band members of Green Day. Anybody know Green Day? Okay. Black sheep. What does it mean to be a black sheep? Well, a relentless desire to invent new approaches, to take the path less traveled by, to be original. And we want to solve intractable problems with a social bent. Now, I think, and of course, challenge the status quo, that goes without saying. Okay, I believe that the only way we're going to solve problems in this generation is by doing things differently than our parents' generation. No offense if you're a parent sitting in the audience, but think about your parents' generation, just work down. Okay, so do things a lot differently here. And my feeling and strong belief is that people sitting in Brasilia are the wrong people to be solving problems for people who are hungry here or for people who have vision problems or whatever. Okay? You're the ones who are going to solve those problems. In fact, you're the ones already solving those problems. It's just we have a media that drowns on about this nonsense going on in Washington and in blah, 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 blah. And it's disconnected from the culture, right? So the change makers are you. And first you have to realize that. Do you realize that? The answer is you. Do you realize that? You do. You sure? You're a black sheep. It's a black sheep. Just a total black sheep. I can tell. So that's what the black sheep is all about, is giving people a community of change makers and artists and entrepreneurs to be able to lock arms with. Now, that's half the equation, right? Get the artists, right? Get the people who are passionate about challenging the status quo. People who have the tattoo, right? You know what I mean? Like, that's cool. I don't have one. You know, I grew up in a family where my mom was an artist and my dad was a judge. So I was a good boy growing up and had this artistic side that hadn't been expressed, and now I'm trying to do both with Black Sheep. And this is the DNA of the people I've worked with to found this organization. It's a group of artists, like I say, people who write books, people who are like Beth Comstock, this chief marketing officer of GE. I've gotten the great honor to work with Beth over the past year and a half on GE's Innovation Advisory Board. She is amazing. She should be the next CEO of GE, in my opinion. She's very, very strong leader. When she walks into a room, people at GE, stand to attention, okay? She's also very creative. She's a black sheep. The way we're going to solve these problems going forward is for people who are the social entrepreneurs and the artists and the creators are going to have to lock arms with people who have the resources, who have the power to get things done quickly. Some of those people are going to be in government. Some of those people are going to be in the corporate world. Some are going to be in the philanthropic world. The black sheep is just one way of bringing those very different types of people together, united by a set of values around ethics and integrity and authenticity, and this belief that there's a big part of us that wants to contribute to creatively solving problems. What could be more meaningful in life, right? I mean, that's really what people want. So I think there's a huge hunger for this. We've seen in art, we do three things. We make thought leadership and art, right? Books, art, social ventures. FuseCore. FuseCore in the United States is a new venture that takes people like you, recruits the best and the brightest, and gives them a one-year fellowship to work with a mayor, governor, or social entrepreneur. So Erica Dimmler is a great example. She was this producer at CNN for 12 years. She was 30-some-odd years old. She was sick and tired of following people around who were just mouthpieces, right? We all know the type. And she had no meaning in her life. She needed a change, so she became a fellow. She got a nice stipend. She went to work in Sacramento for the Sacramento Five School District. Sacramento is a place where the school district has lots of great people, lots of great ideas, but they don't have a lot of resources, okay? Erica came in, reported to the mayor of Sacramento, who's a former NBA basketball player, Kevin Johnson, pretty cool, and his chief of staff, and worked with the students, the faculty, and the administration at Sacramento Five School District to bring a healthy eating program to Sacramento, which is what they wanted. So they literally, I just a few weeks ago went to the launch of this. It was amazing. They put a freaking garden in the middle of the Sacramento Five School District to make food that they're going to now eat, organic food. And what's more, Erica partnered with Alice Waters, who's a very famous U.S. chef of Chez Panisse, this very fancy pants restaurant in Berkeley. And they are working on this new project, Edible Schoolyard Sacramento. It's bottom-up innovation. It's starting with empathizing with the people and building up experiments and putting together, piece by piece, a garden, a menu, together. All of us. This is pretty cool to see in action. You know, a couple years ago, I worked with a group to get this going, so it's very satisfying to see little bets put into action. And Erica's a black sheep, right? And the White House, I was at the White House 2 weeks ago wearing my black sheep hat. I took it off when I walked through the tour of the West Wing and saw the Oval Office, but pretty proudly wore this because The White House Office of Social Innovation thinks that what we're doing is like a big part of the future of how social change is going to have to happen, because everything's moving down from places like Washington into the grassroots. So this is the same trend that's happening I've seen in many, many parts of the world. This whole event is sponsored by the government to try to infuse this type of thinking here. So I say to you, think about being a part of a community of change makers that wants to channel their energies into art, social ventures, and for-profit ventures, by the way. I'm working very closely, as I mentioned earlier, with Jerry Wunda, the Grammy-winning producer, on a music business that's going to be artist-focused and use technology to help artists monetize their creativity in new ways through social media. You can make money on YouTube now. Just look at Justin Bieber. Obviously, he's an unique exception, but you can also do a lot of branding deals. So that's what we're doing. And we're going to use the profits there to plow it back into art and thought leadership. Okay? So there's a Facebook page for the Black Sheep, but this is our team. It's our lawyer, Consigliere Bob. He loves it. Now, Consigliere Bob loves it. He started a law firm. It's a 150-person law firm. He loves it because he wants to make a difference in the world. Everybody has a big part of them that's black sheep. We just have to activate it, right? So there we are, a bunch of crazy Californians having fun. We have an office in San Francisco. It's been, obviously closely connected to Stanford. We have these characters in the entrance of our offices in San Francisco because people, when they see the Pixar characters, become kids again. They just can relax and be creative. So that's Domingo and Lindsay, part of the San Francisco team. These are a bunch of black sheep. We went to dinner last week with some senior executives from Genentech, chief medical officer. They all want to work with us on solving how they think through the problems that are totally different today than in the past, product development problems, how they do clinical trials. The world has changed so quickly that we need to be making these adaptive thinking. So I'll just close. This is Jerry in New York. We have a Williamsburg office in New York. Okay, so it all comes back to this for me, and I hope for you. Why are you here? Why are you doing what you're doing? What values are important to you? This is my family. I grew up in a small town. I never expected to be standing stage of Brazil's social good with the UN Foundation. I mean, geez, this is amazing. Education made it possible, as did all these people. My dad's sitting with his back here, and cousins, aunt, uncles. My Uncle Joe is a truck driver. He was a logger, small business owner his whole life. He's 62 years old. He's one of the people I've admired most all my life, as with my dad and my cousins, all these people. And he wakes up at 2 a.m. every day to drive a truck. 2 a.m. Do you wake up at 2 a.m.? He gets home at 6. He's dilapidated, tired. We all have an Uncle Joe, though, right? We all have people who need us to voice what matters to us. And so that's what the Black Sheep is all about for me. And like I say, you're here for a reason. Think about it and do something. I was going to show you a clip from Frank Gehry, but we don't have time, just to give you some inspiration. But it all starts with a little bet. It starts small. You just have to do something. How many people will promise me that they'll do one little bet, one thing affordable to them, one thing that's achievable to them? How many people will take that pledge? Awesome. Thank you so much for listening. And I bet you there are a lot of black sheep here. So hopefully we can get a black sheep in Florianopolis going, because I can tell you we'd love to have a base in Florianopolis, all right? So thank you all so much. And this is the Black Sheep on Facebook. Thank you so much. Good luck with everything. Let's do this. Thank you.